Thank you, folks. Always good to be back at Google, and I think that the issue is very timely always because we always have problems with energy. But before I talk about turning oil into salt, before I talk about salty commodities, I want to start on a sweet note and talk to you about something I like much more than oil and more than salt, and that is chocolate. I'm sure you all like chocolate, and you probably all consume it on a daily basis. But I want to take you through an exercise, so indulge me for a second. Let's assume that all of us are members of a certain village, and we have this genetic problem in our bodies that the only thing we can eat is chocolate. That's the only thing we can eat. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, chocolate. So I think some of you like the idea. But I tell you, a week like this would be a very, very bad week for all of us. Why is it? Because this week there have been some riots in Ivory Coast. And Ivory Coast is a place that produces 35% of the world's cocoa beans. Okay, so when there is trouble with cocoa beans, those of us who can only eat chocolate, it's a source of great anxiety. Well, luckily, none of us lose sleep over the riots in Ivory Coast because we're not that dependent on chocolate after all. We can eat many other foods and we're just okay. And if something is wrong with chocolate, then all right, not a big deal. And I think if you understand this, you understand what it means, what the concept of turning oil into salt means. It's about strategic commodities. Our energy dependence, our oil dependence problem is not about the amount of oil that we consume or the amount of oil that we import. It is about the fact that oil is the most strategic commodity in the world. Why it is strategic commodity? Because our cars, trucks, ships, and planes can run on nothing but oil. Go to San Francisco or San Jose airport, and you'll see all of the planes have one thing in common. They can run on nothing but oil. When I tried to look into the issue of strategic commodity throughout world history, there were many commodities that at some point human beings depended upon and really shaped the geopolitics of the world in a very fundamental way. And none of them really resonated with me like the story of salt. Because salt, just like oil today, has a monopoly over transportation. Salt used to have a monopoly over food preservation. If you lived in Russia and you wanted to eat well in the middle of the winter, you needed to preserve a lot of food during the summer by curing it with salt. And if you read the world history for generations and generations, it was all about who has salt, where is the salt, how can we build colonies around the world that the areas where salt happens to be located. Countries used to go to war over salt. The word celery comes from the word salt. You heard the expression salt of the earth? Now, if you look at those places that had salt, you see, and I could throw a bunch of names. I doubt that people heard about places like Boa Vista or Tortuga or Turk Island or Orissa. These were important places, just like the Saudi Arabia, the Dubai, and the Abu Dhabis of our own days. Now, what happened? Why is it that right now we live in a world in which we consume more salt than we ever did before? We import more salt than we ever did before, but I don't think we'll ever go to war over salt. I don't think that many of us know who are the biggest world holders of salt. And I don't think we really care. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. We broke the salt monopoly. We broke the monopoly of salt over food preservation. Actually, not we. I give the credit to Napoleon, because in the year 1800, Napoleon, who had really big ambitions and wanted to take over the world, and send his military to Russia, he realized that salt is his Achilles heel. So he said, we're going to introduce a prize, a cash prize. And he declared a prize of 12,000 francs to the person that will come up with a solution to France's salt dependence. All right? And very short time after that, a French chef invented the first form of canning. And later on came refrigeration and electricity, and salt lost its strategic status forever. This is what we need to do to oil. We need to turn oil into salt. We need to strip oil of its strategic status by introducing competition to oil in the transportation sector, the very same sector that happens to underlie the world economy. Remember, the countries that own oil essentially control the world economy, because oil controls transportation, transportation controls the world economy. So if you want to eat asparagus 365 days a year, you need to move it around the globe. And it moves around the globe on board ships and trucks and planes that run on oil. And that has to end. Now, the monopoly of oil in the transportation sector is only half the problem. The second half of the problem, which makes it much worse, is the fact that most of the world oil is controlled by a cartel. And I want to explain to you a little bit about this cartel, because 78% of the world's oil is in the hands of OPEC. 13 governments, not the most democratic of governments in the world, as you know, primarily run by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela. And this cartel produces today less oil than they did 40 years ago. So the world economy doubled. We have China, we have India, we have all of these growth engines, and we need so much more oil, but OPEC today produces less oil than they did 40 years ago. And it's a deliberate policy to constrain demand, the supply of oil, to drill far less than their ability, the geological ability. So you have a situation today that the folks who control 78% of the reserves only produce a third of the supply, and the rest of the 2/3 of the supply are produced by the folks who have less than 20%. It doesn't make sense. And that's why we have to break the oil cartel. But we cannot break the oil cartel. What are we going to do? Bomb them? No, we can't go and throw a bomb in Vienna and destroy the headquarters of OPEC. But what we can do is break the monopoly of oil over transportation by introducing something that OPEC is extremely afraid of, and that is Adam Smith. Competition. All right? And I want to talk to you how we can do it. And I believe we can do it. And I believe it is absolutely essential that we do it, not only because of national security reasons that you all understand, but because it is a precondition for us to retain and maintain our prosperity. Our oil demand imposes a huge levy on our economy. Huge. I mean, people are unaware of how heavy this burden is on our economy. Just to give you a sense, we today, we are in a recession now, okay? And oil is $90 a barrel. I mean, in the middle of a recession, and it's still $90 a barrel. Imagine to yourself what will be the price of oil when we resume growth. Imagine to yourself what happens to oil prices if the dollar collapses and there is a run on commodities. Or what happens if there is inflation and there is a run on commodities. So if oil is $90 in the middle of the recession, it is almost a given that the price will go up as we resume growth. But even today, at $90 a barrel, we pay for oil as a nation more money than we give the Department of Defense to defend us from our enemies. We're talking about $700 billion that we pay as a country for oil. This is, by the way, almost 10 times more than we paid 10 years ago. So in about 10 years, the amount of money that we have to pay as a nation for oil grew tenfold. Now, this is money that instead of staying here, instead of creating jobs and investment opportunities here in the United States, is moving abroad to do nation building. To do nation building in Saudi Arabia, to do nation building in Iran, to do nation building in Venezuela. But it doesn't do nation building here in the United States, where we need the money to build our crumbling economy. And I want to also touch upon a few points that are related to some of the interests of Google that have to do with the price of oil. Google is very interested, for example, in renewable energy. What happens to investment in renewable energy when oil prices go back to $150 a barrel and there is another recession? We cannot afford to have another recession. You know, another recession is like your second heart attack. You can maybe withstand the first one, but if you're too weak and then you get a second one, that's not good. That could be fatal. But what happens to investment in alternative energy and renewable energy when there is a recession? Of course, the funding dries up, investment houses don't have money to invest, everything stops. We see what happens now in Cancun. We see that everything that has to do with trying to advance policies to fix the environment, people are not interested. People are moving away from this issue because there are other priorities. They need to take care of their jobs and mortgages, okay? The other thing that happens when oil prices go up is starvation and devastation in the poor countries of the world. Because those poor countries of the world, in Africa and Latin America, in Asia, they don't get a discount for being poor. They still have to buy oil for $150 or $200 a barrel just like everybody else, okay? So they don't get a preferential treatment for being poor. And that kills them. That destroys them. In some places in Africa, when oil prices go up, you cannot distribute food. And people literally starve. So it is our responsibility to make sure that we do not allow oil prices to go to the levels that we saw in 2008 and beyond. And just this week, the Iranian government, that happens to be the president of OPEC at the moment, said that they're very comfortable with $100 oil. They said that is a fair price. We cannot afford to pay $150 per barrel. And we need to build mechanisms that will prevent oil prices to go to these kind of levels and devastate our economy and other economies as well. What I'm suggesting here, that the most important thing to do in order to break the oil monopoly in transportation is to stop doing the silly things that we are doing today, which is to put cars on the road that can run only on petroleum. Remember we talked about the chocolate before? We continue to produce kids that can only eat chocolate if you want. We continue to produce cars that can only run on oil. And we do it at a rate of about 10 to 15 million a year, only in the United States. So while we are concerned about the future of oil, while we are talking about depletion of oil, while we're talking about all the geopolitical and geoeconomic issues associated with oil, at the same time, we continue to put every year between 10 and 15 million new cars on the road that can run on nothing but oil. How is that for smart policy? You know, they say if you're in a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging, right? Well, we're digging fast. And that has to stop. So luckily, we have technologies and we have the ability to do it, and to do it pretty quickly. Google has been very active on the electrification of transportation, and I think it's a very good idea. Because if people drive cars on electricity, on batteries instead of oil, then few things happen. First of all, you drive your car on something that is cleaner, is more efficient, it's quiet, it's cheaper, it's more environmentally friendly. Even if the electricity is made from coal, it's still better than running your car on gasoline. So there are many, many reasons why we need to electrify our transportation system, why we need to move to electric vehicles. But let us be frank and let us understand that this is not a quick fix. This is not something that can happen overnight. In our book, Turning Oil into Salt, we looked into what does it take to get those batteries quickly into the market. In the end, it's a matter of cost. If your battery costs more than the car, then there is a problem. Okay, so what do we need to do to bring the cost down? The first thing I want you to understand about batteries is, first, it's that the battery is a box full of commodities. It's a smart box. It has a brain, but in the end, it is a big box and it has commodities. A lot of them. About anywhere between 20 and 30 different types of commodities, various metals and minerals that go into the battery. If we are to build a huge fleet of electric vehicles, we need to make sure that we have those commodities. Let me throw a few examples here just to demonstrate the magnitude of the challenge that we are facing. This BlackBerry that I have here has a small battery that takes about 3 grams of something called lithium carbonate, okay? Which is an essential component in the lithium-ion battery. The Volt that GM is putting on the road right now has a battery that takes 24 kilos of lithium carbonate. So when you move from something that takes 3 grams to something that takes 20 kilos and up, and I'm not even talking about the Teslas of the world that take much more, think about what kind of ramp up you need to supply the needs of the world. And we're talking millions of new batteries like this. And we also talk about utility companies that want to build big batteries to store electricity, because one of our problems today with electricity is that, we cannot store it. We don't have storage capacity. But all of these storage batteries will need a lot of materials. And that is true for lithium, that is true for cobalt, that is true for rare earth elements, a family of metals, of 17 metals that happen to be mined today almost entirely in China. And when you look at those minerals, you see that every single one of them tells a story, and sometimes not a very happy story. Cobalt, for example. 50% of the world cobalt is concentrated in the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, let me tell you what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the past decade, there has been a genocide that is even worse than the Holocaust. More than 6 million people were killed there in civil war. We're talking about 40% of the women in Congo were raped at one point or another. This is a total hell. And this is where our cobalt is coming from. And this civil war can resume any day because the tensions are still there and nothing has been resolved over the years, and this is a very, very unstable place. Rare earth elements were in the news recently when China imposed a minor embargo in rare earth supply to Japan and to the United States, because they were unhappy about some of the policies and because one Japanese fishing ship collided into another Chinese ship and they were, up in arms, and they decided to punish the Japanese by not sending them rare earth for their battery industry. So what we have to realize is that while we want the solar panels, the wind turbines, the electric vehicles, the electric motors, we're going to have to make sure that we have all of these materials to supply our needs for the 21st century. It's not going to happen just because we want it to happen. It will happen if we take the necessary steps to ensure that we have the entire supply chain of those next generation energy devices. And we have to invest in it. We have to invest in developing a domestic supply chain. We need to invest in mining, because as much as you like renewable energy, as much as you like the solars and the wind and the electric vehicles, you have to realize that renewable energy, like it or not, begins at the mine. If you want to build those big 4-megawatt offshore wind turbines, you need huge magnets, huge. Hundreds of kilos of neodymium, which is one of the rare earth metals that I talked about. Okay? So that's one thing to remember about the electrification of transportation. We have to reduce some of the cost of some of the components in the battery supply chain. One of the things that we revealed in the book is that the most expensive component of an auto battery today is something called a separator. It's a thin sheet of plastic, very smart plastic, but something that looks like thin sheet of plastic that separates between the anode and the cathode. This intellectual property makes about 10 to 12% of the cost of the battery. The IP actually belongs to Exxon Chemicals. So that's the kind of things we need to pay attention to. How can we bring down the cost of batteries? How can we identify those components in the battery that can really bring the cost down to allow the expedited commercialization? If you looked at batteries today in China, you see something very interesting. They're very cheap. Much cheaper than the batteries that we put in the cars in the United States. Now why? Because the demands from the battery in China are much less stringent than they are in the United States. We want here a battery that will run for 10 years or 100,000 miles. And the Chinese say, well, you know, maybe instead of 10 years, we'll do 7 years. That's good enough. And because the demands are less stringent, they can get lower cost. And I think the key is to really begin to put cars on the road and to start with a good enough and to improve it later on. We did not wait for the Intel Centrino to put the Commodore 64 in the marketplace, okay? We started with something that today looks really silly and not a great computer, but at the time it was good enough. And I think we should adopt this mindset of starting with the good enough, improving it as the years go by. And I believe that we will see electrification. But the question is, what's going to happen in the next 20 years before we see electric vehicles in very large numbers? Will we be able to survive the oil spikes that will come, no doubt, and could drive our economy into chaos in the next 20 years? Can we afford to bet the farm only on one solution, and that's the electric car, and neglect the intermediate and near-term solutions? I believe that we cannot have this luxury. I think it would be a huge mistake. A few years ago, we had a president who said, a kid born today, his first car will be a hydrogen fuel cell car. Well, this kid is almost 10 years old now. And I don't think that the first car that he or she will drive will be a hydrogen fuel cell car. So even though we think that sometimes we know what the future will look like, sometimes that's not the case. And we need to have stopgap solutions. And I think that the most important stopgap solution is to have liquid fuel choice. We need to have liquids that can coexist with our gasoline system on board pretty much the same internal combustion engines, and to make sure that we have a healthy competition in the transportation fuel market among a number of fuels. Now let's talk a little bit about the liquids, because I believe that if there is something that is missing in our energy picture is this liquid fuel competition. First of all, how do we enable liquid fuel competition? The first thing that needs to happen is that the cars that we put on the road are flex fuel vehicles. Flex fuel vehicles are cars that look and behave like the cars that you drive today, with one difference. There is a chip, and there is a more robust fuel line. The plastics and the rubbers are made from materials that are more resistant to corrosion. And that enables a whole family of alcohols and ethers and commodity chemicals to be blended into our gasoline at any ratio, at any combination that you want, and reduce the amount of oil that we need to move us from one place to another. Most of you are familiar with ethanol. This is only one of those alcohols. Everybody has an opinion about ethanol. Some people like ethanol. Some people hate ethanol. Both have good arguments. I'm not here to rebut any of this. You know, ethanol has good attributes, it has bad attributes, but what I want to make sure is that you all understand that ethanol is only one of many liquids that currently can play a role in the transportation fuel market, but they are not allowed to do it because the cars are not warranted to run on them. Sort of like you go to a bar and all you can order is vodka. But you like gin or rum or whiskey. And you should be able to buy any form of alcohol that you want in this bar. But if the barman says, sorry, only vodka is allowed, what can you do? Let me talk a little bit about an alcohol that I think presents a very, very promising potential for a variety of reasons. And it's called methanol. Methanol is essentially wood alcohol. It's it's a very simple alcohol. It can be made from anything that contains carbon. It can be made from natural gas. It can be made from coal. It can be made from biomass material. And guess what? And we describe it in chapter 6 of the book. It can also be made from CO2. Wouldn't that be nice if we could take CO2 and convert it into fuel? Instead of finding all kind of innovative ways, expensive ways to take the CO2, to ship it all over the place, to bury it somewhere in the ground and hope that it stays there forever, we can take the same CO2 and recycle it by using it as a building block for liquid fuel that can run in the very same cars that we have today. That's the kind of thing I would like to see us doing with CO2. This is the kind of thing that methanol can allow us to do. Methanol, you know, we just found a lot of natural gas in this country. Natural gas prices are very low. Natural gas burns cleaner than oil. Why not make methanol from natural gas? Methanol from natural gas sells today for about $1 a gallon. Clearly very competitive with oil. Methanol from biomass is easier and cheaper to do than ethanol from biomass, because we don't need to invent all kind of bugs and enzymes and all kind of funny creatures that will digest the biomass. We can simply gasify the biomass and turn it into wood alcohol, methanol. Methanol offers us all kind of opportunities overseas. I just heard a few days ago that in Iraq, 50% of Iraq's natural gas is being flared. Flared! Can you imagine? And this is methane, this is not CO2. So you take one of the most potent greenhouse gases and you flare it. And that happens in Africa, that happens all over the world. We take something that is a very useful source of energy and we burn it. What a waste. But if you could capture this gas and monetize it by commoditizing it, by turning it into methanol, which is a very easy conversion, then all of a sudden you can sell it. Then you don't have to flare it. And those poor countries can make some money. And apropos poor countries, what do poor countries do? What are they good at? Agriculture. Most poor people in the world work in agriculture. Most poor people in the world grow plants. That's what they do. They don't work at Google. They grow plants. And if we have an alcohol economy, if we have cars that can run on alcohol in addition to gasoline, those countries will be able to produce their own fuels. They will be able to grow more and more of their fuels instead of buying oil for $150 or $200 or $300 a barrel oil. So if we go again and face one of those spikes in price, at least there will be something that they can do to alleviate this economic pain. And I want to explain to you, to give you a demonstration, what happens to an economy that has fuel flexibility, that has those flex fuel cars, which, by the way, cost only $100 extra for an auto manufacturers to make. So if you're a GM or Ford or Chrysler, if you want to make all of your cars flex fuel, it's roughly $100 per car. GM claims 70, okay? So let's take a country that actually did that. It's called Brazil. And let's look what happened to Brazil, where 90% of cars sold in Brazil are flex fuel vehicles. Let's see what happened to Brazil in 2008, when all of us suffered under this terrible $150 oil situation. In Brazil, it was barely felt. Why? Because Brazilians had fuel choice at the pump. When oil prices became too high, they had cars that were able to absorb alternatives, and they opted for the lowest cost fuel, just like anybody would do. I mean, people are economic creatures after all. And you know what happened in Brazil in 2008? Something really remarkable. Gasoline in Brazil in 2008 became an alternative fuel. Less gasoline was sold in Brazil than ethanol, which they happen to make from sugarcane. So you see that when you look at it from the standpoint of strategic commodities, we have alternatives to oil. But we need to put them to work. We need to be able to allow those alternatives to play in a free market environment. Today we have a mandate that says that we can only use gasoline in our cars. We have to have a different mandate. We have to have a mandate that says that you cannot sell a car in the United States unless it offers you fuel choice. That is the mandate that I would like to see happening in this country. We should have an open fuel standard that requires that every car sold in America, if you are Ford or Toyota and you want to sell cars in the United States, they have to offer fuel choice. And yes, you'll have to invest the extra $100 in making the cars, just like you invested a few dollars in putting a seatbelt or an airbag or a rear view mirror or an FM radio, or just recently I heard a camera that sort of watches how you drive in reverse to prevent accident. The economic benefit is clear. It is a way for us to cut our oil expenditure significantly. It is a way for us to protect ourselves against oil spikes that can drive us into our second and potentially fatal heart attack. It is a way for us to protect our national interest and our national security. All of those alternatives are more environmentally friendly than gasoline. So there's clear environmental benefit by using all of the above, whether it is electricity, alcohols, you name it. So this is really something that we could do without putting an onerous burden on our deficit, without Congress paying many, many billions of dollars to implement all kind of policies. You all know what kind of Congress we have today in Washington. This is a Congress that was elected on the platform of fiscal conservatism. So there's not going to be a lot of money to go around to distribute to all kind of great project that maybe some of you would like to see. So we have to be realistic. And if I started talking about politics, maybe I will throw in one or two thoughts here about the new Congress. We have a Republican control over the House, and very likely in the next, in 2 years from now, there'll be a Republican control over the Senate. So any way you look at it, when you have 23 Democrats running for re-election in the Senate and only 10 Democrats, the likelihood is that in 2012 Republicans will take over the Senate as well, if not the House, White House too. So we have to think about solutions that can be accepted by Republicans and Democrats alike. This is the reality that we live in. And we cannot afford to spend the next 4, 5, 6, I don't know how many years, but at least 4, on policies that have zero chance of success. And I think that there is one policy that can really capture the interest of both Republicans and Democrats is the open fuel standard. Because Republicans, as well as Democrats, don't like our oil dependence. They don't like the fact that we export hundreds of billions of dollars every year to our enemies. They don't like the fact that we are beholden to those governments. And they don't like monopolies and cartels. So I think that in this respect, we have a winning combination that if we just get some focus, we can get this done in this coming year. And if we do that, we break the oil cartel, we break the monopoly of oil, we turn oil into salt. This is how you become energy independent. This is how you strip oil of its strategic status. No longer chocolate-only society. Thank you.
Hello? There we go. Okay, thank you for that stimulating talk. I'm going to lead off with a few questions just to get the ball rolling, and then I'll turn things over to the audience. And I guess we don't have mics for the audience, right? So you'll have to repeat the question, yeah. So first question is, on this flex fuel initiative, which is very attractive, I buy the $100 per car argument, but the other side is the distribution network. So think back in the 70s, there were a lot of oil burning heat. The price of oil goes up. Basically, everybody switched to gas because it was relatively cheap to do the switch as long as you had natural gas distribution to your point of fuel usage. So what are the estimates of the cost for providing the distribution system for flex fuels?
Yes, the distribution will happen only when there are cars. No gas station owner will go into the hassle of retrofitting their pumps and storage tanks unless they see that there are 20-25% of the cars on the road can actually run on the fuel. Okay, so we got to start with the cars here. And that's why it's important that we have an open fuel standard, because 3 years after you introduce an open fuel standard, you have enough cars on the road to reach this sweet spot in which gas station owner says, now it makes sense for me to collect this tax credit and go through the hassle of retrofitting a pump or two and maybe next year a third one, and gradually to turn all the pumps into alcohol pumps. Now, the important thing to remember about flex fuel is you A flex fuel car is like your cup of coffee. You can mix any amount of coffee and milk that you want. Okay, you can drink your coffee black like I do. You can have a little bit of milk. You can have a lot of milk. But if you're allergic to milk, you can drink soy milk or coconut milk or rice milk, okay? The car doesn't care. You can mix any combination of gasoline, ethanol, and methanol at any blend you want, and the car could not care. So it's not that you move from one liquid to another, okay? You can mix them and blend them as you wish. Having fuel choice, by the way, does not mean that you need to exercise the choice. If you have fuel choice and you still want to run your car on gasoline, fine, do it. Nobody is forcing you to do it. Just like nobody is forcing you. If you have a plug-in hybrid car that can run on electricity and liquid fuels, nobody is forcing you to plug it in. If you don't feel like plug it in, fine. Drive your car on liquids. So I think that what it gives you is the flexibility, and I believe that supply chain and distribution chain will follow once there is incentive, once there are cars, and once, of course, the oil prices are going to the place where I think that they are going, which is north.
One fuel that you didn't mention that would work quite easily for vehicles is propane. I mean, there are 13 million propane-powered vehicles in the U.S., in the world, according to the Wikipedia. And here in the Bay Area, we see lots of signs saying this bus is driven by propane. We already have a distribution mechanism for that. There are a lot of public vehicles that are running on propane. How come that isn't part of the solution here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's called CNG, compressed natural gas.
Yeah, LNG maybe. Or
it's not LNG,
okay.
it's compressed natural gas. It's gas that you basically compress it and put it in a canister. It takes half of your trunk, and then you can drive your car. And it's a very elegant solution for fleets. And that's why you see buses and some taxis and garbage trucks and so forth. However, we looked at our institute at various ways to utilize natural gas in transportation. And we realized that the best way to use natural gas in transportation, other than making electricity from it and then run it in electric vehicles, is to turn the natural gas into methanol. And I want to explain why. The cost of a platform to run on CNG is in the thousands extra. In other words, today to convert your car to run on CNG, you're talking at least $10,000 conversion, at least. Whereas to make your car flex fuel, $100. So it's much easier in terms of cost to go to the methanol flex fuel route than the CNG. However, I'm not opposed to it. I think that there is a role for it in the overall mixture. Around the world, as you mentioned, there are well over 10 million vehicles that can do it and already do it. But if you look carefully into those numbers, you see that most of those vehicles are in places like Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And the reason that you see it there and less so in the developed world is because the equipment that they use, the tanks that they use, are made from low-grade materials. And that imposes all kind of safety concerns. You really, if you want to put your family in a car like this, you really want to make sure that the canister is made from very, very strong materials that are normally very, very expensive to make. You don't want to put it in a small tank that is explosive and so forth. So I think that if we are to do it in the United States, we'll have to have very high safety standards that will make it much more expensive, which is why I go back to the original argument that is much easier to do it, to take the gas and make it into alcohol and then use the alcohol in the existing platforms.
So one thing you didn't mention in the discussion of methanol, which I think is very relevant, is the fact that in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen a revolution in natural gas production in the United States with horizontal drilling and shale gas. If you look on the web, you can find maps of the U.S. with shale gas deposits that are really quite striking. Now, there's some environmental issues with respect to extraction here, but in general, it looks like it would be very, very easy for the U.S. to be completely energy sufficient and indeed an exporter of natural gas using LNG technology. So what you're describing is quite feasible in terms of domestic capability, I would say.
I think that the question to ask is, I mean, look, we got a gift. This country got a gift. It's like all of a sudden an uncle that you never knew died, and you find yourself with a big inheritance. Nobody expect, even in my book, I must admit, I wrote it before this natural gas revolution started. And I wasn't as bullish on natural gas as I am today. So things happen very quickly, very suddenly. But the question to ask is, if we are to use natural gas in transportation, what is the best way of doing it? How do we get the most economic activity from each cubic meter of natural gas? How do we get the most energy security value from each cubic meter of natural gas? How do we make the most environmental value from each cubic meter of natural gas? And we have to look at, because as you said, there are more than one way of using natural gas, and we have to sort of go into this analysis to make sure that we don't squander this gift, that we really put it to use in the best way, the most efficient way, so they can really utilize it in the best way. Because after all, natural gas too is a finite resource, so we want it to last for as many years and move around as many people and goods. And that can be done, I think, the best way through the conversion to liquids. And later on, when we have electric cars, the production of electricity, and then we can run those electric cars that are made from electricity made from, among other things, natural gas.
Okay, well, let me open this up to questions.
Sure. Some of what you're describing at the upper level, it sounds vaguely like a policy that's a lightning rod. And, you know, at wartime, lightning rod policies happen, but this seems like a lower grade. Is there an equivalent of an economic warfare or economic policy lightning rod that has been employed in the past that is an example that you would use to roll out something like this? Because, you know, at first you want to do the car conversion, but then in order to really, hammer the point home, you have to have the capacity to supply the energy in the form, at least to a certain proportion.
So give a quick summary of the question.
If I understand the question correctly, you're looking for precedent, historical precedent of how we were able to break through this political gridlock, I take it, to really impose a requirement on changes to the vehicle platform.
Right, but it's an economic type of warfare.
Well, I think that, first of all, the case of Brazil. I mean, Brazil started their flex fuel vehicle exercise that brought them to where they are today after the 1973 embargo. They got a wake-up call. They realized that they suffered a great deal as a result. They had a military dictatorship, which it helped that, you know, in terms of decision-making, but they no longer do. Now it's a democracy. But at the time, they realized that they no longer want to be in this situation that somebody stopped the supply of oil, and they don't want to face this vulnerability, and they went down this road. We have a number of precedents in this country even that in time of war, and there were all kind of mandates that were introduced. For example, you know, the reason that we have FM radio, you know, it's by law you need to have an FM radio, and automakers are by law required to provide FM radio to every car that they sell. And that goes back to the Cold War, when the military had all kind of plans to expropriate frequencies, and they really wanted to make sure that the public can remain informed in time of emergency. So, you know, we have those precedents in which national security arguments, but today I think it's even easier because we have an auto industry that's still living off our dime. and the auto industry, that every time that the oil prices go up and they cannot sell those SUVs, they come to us and ask for our money to keep them alive. So I think that one of the things we can do is tell them, look, guys, if you want our money again, you got to give us something in return. And the least you can do is give us fuel choice.
Well, one example that might be a historical precedent is the Sputnik and then the race to the moon, and there were billions and billions of dollars committed in a peacetime effort to achieve a technological goal. So it can be done. It just has to be pitched in the right way. Question?
I don't know if that would work set up, but I'm sure it might be you. So my question is, if I run out and buy a new car right now, is it the case that I could go spend $100 and upgrade it, or it seems like there might be other issues of emissions and stuff like that, or is that is there some kind of in-between thing that the manufacturers can do so that if I want to upgrade later, because it seems like the futures market, if the oil-producing countries saw that we were gearing up for this, that would have an immediate impact on their behavior.
You're talking about aftermarket conversions, and it can be done. There are folks who sell those kits for a few $100s. I think that of course, technically it can be done. It will be more expensive if it's done as an aftermarket than if it's done at the manufacturer's level, which is why I'm focusing on the manufacturers, because I think that's the best way to put a lot of cars in a very short time to start off this program of getting the infrastructure to follow and the investors in alternative fuels to follow, because they need some certainty as well. But I think that as we go forward on this, there'll probably be all kind of entrepreneurs that will buy used cars and ship them, I don't know, to Mexico or China and have them go through a retrofit and sell the engine back to the US market. We could see all that, but our focus now is to get the automakers to produce those cars and to make sure that they produce it in such a way that is not only warranted to run on ethanol, but is also warranted to run on methanol, because methanol is the most corrosive of all alcohols. So if a car can run on methanol, it can run on all the other alcohols and the ethers.
So I wanted to ask you how much rare earth and other rare minerals are getting into the production of the cars themselves?
How many?
How much of the rare earths and other rare minerals are required to produce the cars themselves? And aren't we running into the same problem with production of any car?
Yeah, first of all, there are already a lot of applications in your car and in your home and in everything that around us. You know, those monitors have rare earth, fluorescent lights have rare earth, but of course also the car. And that depends on the car, it depends on the type of battery. Each battery has different rare earth. For example, if you have a nickel metal hydride battery, you probably have more lanthanum. If you have lithium ion battery, you're probably going to have more neodymium. So you know, each battery chemistry requires different materials. Just to give you a sense, we're talking something like a Toyota Prius, something in the order of about 20 kilos of cumulative rare earth, which is quite a lot if you think about a market of about 170,000 tons globally. And we'll need much more of it as we move into bigger and bigger applications.
Let me ask a question about ethanol. So as I understand it, a car now with no modifications can burn up to 10% mix of ethanol with gasoline, right?
Yes.
And so if you applied the modification, this $100 modification you were describing, you could have a larger fraction of ethanol in the fuel mix?
Just like the coffee and the milk, remember?
Much larger.
Much, well,
substantially
at least
larger,
85%. And in places like Brazil, you could do 100%. The reason that we can go up to 85 is because of the cold temperatures in the winter. But yeah, certainly you can use up to 85% alcohol. And it's the kind of thing that consumers will decide. You know, we would like to see, for example, the concept of blender pump. A blender pump is sort of like those ice cream machines that you have a chocolate on the one hand and the vanilla on the other. In the middle, you have this one that sort of blends the two. A blender pump will do the same. You'll come to a gas station and you'll have a knob, and you'll be able to determine what blend you want to have in your tank. And I think that you will make the decision, or the gas station owner probably will make the decision based on the daily economics of the fuel. So in one day when gasoline is up and alcohol is down, they will shift the knob towards the alcohol, and then you'll get more alcohol in your tank. But the beauty of it is that the car doesn't really care. So you can really mix it in any combination. To your point about the 10%, one of the problems we have today with ethanol is because there is a blend wall. You can only blend 10%. There is no justification to grow the ethanol industry. The ethanol industry cannot grow anymore because they hit this blend wall. And in fact, they're exporting this stuff now. So America became a net ethanol exporter because the market is saturated, which is why we need to remove this blend wall altogether. And the way to remove this blend wall is to make sure we move to flex fuel cars.
So it sounds like the political support from the ethanol lobby would be there for this proposal. And on top of it, you would have strong political support from the natural gas industry, because natural gas is also dramatically lower in price. People are looking for ways to increase consumption.
I call this the AAA, the American Alcohol Alliance.
I'll join.
And indeed, that's the vision that I have, to marry the traditional farm groups with the natural gas industry and have them all support a vehicle platform that can accommodate the alcohol that is made in the Midwest and the alcohol that is made in the natural gas, or that will be made in hopefully in the natural gas states, and also the alcohol that will be brought from friendly countries like Brazil. I mean, let's face it. Why is it we don't have tax on imported oil, but we have tax on imported alternative fuel? If you want to import today ethanol from Brazil, you pay 54 cents a gallon. It's crazy. And so we have to open the market, and then we don't need this protectionism because the market will be big enough for everybody to profit.
Let's take another question back there. Yes. You could just go ahead.
You say a lot about ethanol and trying to focus on it, but it comes from food production, so it takes away land for food production. Isn't that like the step backward in case of the world where we have a hunger crisis?
Yeah, it's a question that I get asked a lot about food versus fuel. If we produce ethanol, how is that going to affect food production? Well, I think that the anti-ethanol industry has done a very good job in instilling this food versus fuel myth. The Congressional Research Service looked into it, and as well as the World Bank, by the way, and they concluded that it's certainly not true. The fact that food prices went up in 2008 was primarily driven by the fact that oil prices went up. And in fact, food prices today are cheaper. The growth in food prices is the slowest in more than 20 years, even though ethanol production is growing. The reality is that the two answers here. One is that not every form of ethanol can and must be made from food. Certainly today we make ethanol from corn, and in some places from sugarcane, but we can make ethanol from lots of other feedstocks that don't conflict with food crops. The second thing that I would say about this is that look, corn is like any other commodity. When there is a rush on commodities, you'll see that the rise in corn prices follows the rise of gold, the rise of silver, the rise of sugar, oil, natural gas, you name it. All commodities go up, all commodities go down. What we use the ethanol for, the corn for, when in the ethanol industry, we use the sugars. In food, we use the proteins. Okay, so when you look at the corn, you have sugars and proteins. We do not use the sugars. We do not use the sugars in our food production. We use the proteins, and therefore, they're two separate issues. If you go to an ethanol plant, you'll see that they separate the sugars from the proteins. They take the proteins, they feed it to cows, and they take the sugars and they refine it into ethanol. So there shouldn't be any conflict here. Now, the fact that you hear about bread riots in Egypt and tortilla riots in Mexico, that's not because of ethanol. It is not. In fact, why should there be bread riots in Egypt if we don't make ethanol from wheat? So it was a political ploy that was very well orchestrated, and we know today that it was completely fabricated.
So I think we're running short of time here. Gal, you will be around for at least a half hour or so signing books, and you can ask any of these remaining questions personally. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.